that you would continue to be with us during these presentations, that your presence be with us, Lord, that your heavenly angels surround us and press back the influence of the enemy, Lord. We pray a blessing on the speaker at this hour, Lord, that you would bless her to speak the words you would have her to speak, Lord, as she presents this message, Lord, that you would clarify all misunderstandings, Lord, that this message had on some, Lord, that as she reviews this study, that all of us be blessed and really enriched in the truth, Lord. And I just pray that you would help us, Lord, because we really want to be faithful to you all the way to the end. And we understand that understanding these truths is very important, Lord, especially when we have a responsibility to teach. So please help us, God. In Jesus' name I do pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, we're going to continue with the original footage from 2012. Parminder was presenting the prediction of the 126, and also includes the 151.
It is it big enough?
Excuse me? Yeah. For me it is. How you said?
What page?
It's good, thank you.
22. Page 22. It's good, you said?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay. During the break, there was decision that went about clarification in respect to what the test was. So one of the brethren here wanted to ask the question again, kind of a question quote statement, so that they could understand in clearer fashion exactly what I meant. What I'm saying is these tests are these dates and events. So the tests are dates and events here, as opposed to moral sins, just to clarify that situation. And someone in the audience is talking. Are you saying that these dates here, do these dates have anything to do with morality, or are they just statements? Therefore, rendering the test merely, someone's ability to recollect, and that being the test, with the morality being kind of just on the side. And Parminder, so no, it's not just, it's a history lesson with morality to one side. I think it's our understanding of what morality is and is not. We could ask the question, is Sabbath morality?
Page 13.
Thank you.
No, 14.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. And the answer would be yes. But if you ask the question, well, how it relates to the interaction between human beings in the sense of being good or doing good, then it really is dependent of that. But God has deemed it a test of morality, a test of discipleship. And not only with that, he's encoded in keeping of the Sabbath a blessing. But above and beyond that, I'm just going to read the Spirit of Prophecy quote that we read at the beginning. It's found in early writing 206.1. It says, many looked with horror at the course of the Jews in rejecting Christ, and as they read the history of his shameful abuse, they think they love him. Hold on a minute. Put that. Okay, I took it off the hook. Let me put it in my drawer. Sorry. Let's see. Okay, so they see how Christ was treated, and they said that they loved him, and they wouldn't have behaved in the same way. Now, in the history of Christ, people of God received a test. They received a test, and the reception of that test that manifests whether they love God. They think they love him and will not have denied him as Peter did, or crucified him as the Jews. Then it reads this, but God who reads the hearts of all. And in this context, the hearts of all and the people who are living in this history. So he's reading the hearts of all the people who live in this history, because Ellen White is dealing with this history now. God who reads the hearts of all has brought to the test that love for Jesus which they profess to feel. So what Ellen White is saying, what Ellen White says there, is that love that they have for Jesus, whoever they are, is not humanity in a generic sense. It's talking about the people who are living in this history. They have a love for God, for Christ, and God is going to bring a test, that test of love. He's going to bring the test that shows or exhibits whether they have love for Christ or not. So we hope we can all see that there. He says, but God reads the hearts of all, has brought to the test that love for Jesus which they profess to feel. All heaven watched with the deepest interest the reception of the first angel's message. So there's the test. How are you going to receive the first angel's message? It's the test to discern whether you love Jesus or not. And what was the first angel's message? When it's verbalized, Revelation 14, the realization is that is the judgment hour has come. In the book of John, in the book of Acts, when you verbalize the first angel's message, it's sin. It's the message of sin. But when you historize it in this history with these people, it's not per se the judgment hour is coming, although that's what it's talking about. It's not that. Let's look at the people's sins and we would commonly understand them. But the test to prove that you love God is accepting the information, all the messages, all the light that God is pouring upon his people in this history. And what was the light or the information that he was going to pour out? He wasn't pouring out light that said, you need to be a better person. He was pouring out light, but said, you need to understand 1798. You need to understand 1840. You need to understand 1842 and 1843. That's the light that he saw fit for God's people to accept, which testifies whether they love him. In any test that God devises, that he decides to bring upon God's people, is inherently moral. It's as moral as committing murder. It says moral is lying. So the acceptance or rejection of this truth is as moral as the 10 Commandments.
You know, it's kind of interesting is that when you have this a message that's based on these dates and events, when the Revelation 14, fear God, give glory to him for the hour of his judgment has come. So here you have these dates and the events. So if you're just told to go live a better life, Jesus is coming, go stop sinning, Jesus is coming, it doesn't affect you morally. But it puts fear in your heart when you see dates and events that show it.
Right.
Just a thought that came to my mind.
Well, yeah, it's like we see, like I'm in this, I don't know, I'm in the spot where, well, everything's almost done. It's almost over. You know, we don't know how long, but we know it's not long at all. So we fear God. You know, we fear God.
So believing the test is gonna do the moral work in you, because it's gonna put his fear in your heart that judgment is coming.
Right.
I think that's really interesting. Sorry, Tony, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
What you just said, Elaine, because I was thinking of the Greeks in Paul's day and how virtue, right? They were studying like man's virtues and philosophies and how to be a good person, a moral person, taking God out of the equation. Like you could do it on your own, right? The virtues. And that's what they say, that virtue Ellen White quotes that, or I should say, I'm trying to quote Ellen White, virtue is better than vice, but they leave God out of it. And so in a way that's interesting what you said, because he's testing to see if we know who he is.
Yeah.
Because anybody could come up with a moral message. Do you know what I mean? All the other Christian religions talk about do not do this or do not do that. So in a sense, God is trying to find out if we know who he really is, who God really is. And this is kind of the test to see whether or not we do, I
And
think.
more so, even what he's capable of doing.
Yeah, that we can see him in this prophecy, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Isn't that where the 25-20 comes in?
Yeah. Yep.
So let's begin to parallel the Millerite history with our history, with the history of the final generation, the history of the 144,000. Before I proceed, I want to say this. Besides the brethren who are watching this presentation, there are other brethren who by God's grace will be watching these presentations via internet. I'm aware that there are going to be two groups of people that are going to see this information. There are those brethren who are antagonistic and combative or in opposition, who want to verbalize against this message, the message of Daniel 11, this whole encapsulation of all this information. I'm aware of that.
That's quite interesting statement, looking back at 2012 and looking at what we're at today.
History is
I'm
totally repeating
aware
itself.
that there's going to be two groups of people.
Yeah. There are other brethren who are going to be listening to this presentation, who are sympathetic to the message, who agree with this message. I want to address that class of brethren here quickly. And it's to say to them, to those of you who wherever you may be, if you're already sympathetic to this message, that when I lay out this outline of the 104,000 or the final generation, and obviously in the title of this timeline, those who are not in agreement with the message would be opposed to these titles anyway. So I'm really addressing the people who are sympathetic to this message. As I lay this timeline, it's to examine whether this timeline is correct. Because what I'm going to do in the first stage of this presentation is to build up this information and to make an application. Most people are focusing upon the application at the end, and they're having trouble with that. And I understand those difficulties. But from my perspective, that final piece of information is built upon the premise that this is correct. So I would ask those who are not opposing this message to just look at the information and see to see any light in it. But those who are already sympathetic to examine whether this timeline is being constructed correctly. And if it isn't, then the final premise doesn't stand on the platform anyway. So I hope that's clear. We're back in Daniel 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south, atheistic France, push at him, the papacy, in 1798. At the time of the end, and we get to the semicolon in the King James, and then we see the verses say, and the king of the north, the papacy, shall come against him, the king of the south, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. They shall enter in the country and shall overflow, pass over. There's a lot to that verse, which I don't want to get into. There's the symbology and the chariots and the horsemen and the ships, or it's overthrown, passed over, all of that. What I want to focus on is that the papacy is going to come against the king of the south. Now, this verse is constructing in a very interesting way, because as I read this, I'll ask you to investigate how you understand this verse. Is that the king of the north shall come against the king of the south at the time of the end? So two things happen at the time of the end. First, the king of the south comes against the king of the north. And then at the time of the end, the king of the north comes against the king of the south. I didn't put it in here, but I'll put this on now. That France wars against the papacy, and this is the deadly wound. When it comes to the second part of the verse, it talks about the king of the south and the king of the north. When it says it then that the king of the north, or the papacy, it now comes against the king of the south. But in this history, the king of the south, and I'm going to put this term, atheistic France, the king of the south, is no longer atheistic France. It's changed now to USSR, the Soviet Union. And I'm not going to go through the history of that now, but there's a general acceptance on both sides of the issue that this is so. But most people who either accept the message, Daniel 11, or even don't, generally accept that the papacy makes war against the USSR. There's a disagreement in the application of the term, time of the end, and the date, because the papacy, when it comes against the USSR, it's not a one-off event. It's a sequence of events that culminates in dismantling of the Soviet Union. I will say, it's very interesting to study to see the process of dismantling of the USSR, how it works, who did it, and the ins and outs of that. The reason why that's interesting is because in verse 41, it says, he, the king of the north, and the papacy shall enter also into the glorious land. And what that verse is saying is that way that he entered into the countries of the king of the south, and it will enter into the glorious land in the same way. And what I will point out here is that when he entered the USSR is not a country, it's a union of states. And the reason why that's important to understand is because the United States is also a union of states. So you have the Union of States during the Civil War. You have the United States of America was warring against not Russia, but the Soviet Union. You had a Union of States warring against another Union of States. And the papacy dismantles this Union of States in verse 40. And in verse 41, it says, he will also do the same in stroke with the glorious land. And I think there's a great light that is there waiting to be understood on the process of that entry into the glorious land and the dismantling of that union. So the point I want to focus on is the time of the end and the dates. And we could go from 1989 to 1991. It's in this time period that the Soviet Union is dismantled. This Union of States gets broken up. Many people, when they look at this verse, they understand it to read this way. At the beginning of the time of the end is 1798. This event happens. Then during the time of the end, or at some time in the time of the end, this event happens. I don't believe that this verse is teaching that. I'm not going to argue against people in that concept. The time of the end is an event plus a period of time, so that we could be living in a period of time, the time of the end. But what I would say is this date marked the beginning of the time of the end for this people. So this event and this time period marks the beginning of the time of the end for this group of people. In a crude fashion, I'm saying there are two types of the ends. There is the typical, if you like, anti-typical. So this notion or concept of the time of the end, which is applied to a specific generation, is that this generation has come to the time of its end in a micro sense. The world has come to its time period where the world is now at the time of the end, from 1798 to when Michael stands up in the second advent. But on a micro level, these people, this generation that lived, have come to the time period when their end has begun. They had the time of the end, and then their probation closes. And so it will be for the 144,000. Because at the time of the end, this happens. At the time of the end, this happens. Not during the time of the end. So at the time of the end, this happens, inferring that this indeed is the beginning at the time of the end and the end of this generation. Okay, I'm going to stop there just for a second. So I did not draw out any of the chart work. I just kind of highlighted and trying to emphasize what he's saying. So when he's repeating himself and he says here and here, he's talking about what's on the board. Just, you probably already know that, but I would just like to state that just in case. I'm going to proceed. So that's one point I want to highlight. The other point is, so what I've done here, by the way, it gets the time of the ends winding up. And because the first angel's message is attached to an event, Ellen White talks about this concept, by the way, where she says the messages are located. We need to locate the messages. And we see that all these messages are now located. So you can conceptualize that you had these three messages just hanging in space, and you can read about them. You'd say, well, they're interesting messages, but what do we do with them? Who do we apply to? So to make an application of these messages, you need to pluck them all out of midair, and you need to put them somewhere. And look at what we're going to do. We're going to get this first angel's message that was plucked out of this loose air that was hanging up, and we're going to fix it to this event. And not only an event, a date. We fix it to an event and the date. When we get to the second angel's message that was out there floating around, we pick it up and we lock it in to an event and a date. And the event here is the closing of the doors. So we're going to get a second angel's message and lock it into an event and a date. Then we're going to get a third angel's message, and we're going to lock it into an event, the close of probation, and a date. So in the Millerites' history, we have located the message or historized them. We have put them into history. We should be doing the same in our history.
So he's saying that you can lock the third angel's message to an event and a date.
All three of them.
Yeah, all three of them, but I was pointing out the third because we had all that wrong. So he's gearing up to give the 126 message, I guess.
Okay.
Because he locks it into 2014.
These three angels' message, because that was a partial fulfillment, and they're going to be fulfilled again. The complete fulfillment in the time period in which we live in. We must get these messages and we must locate them in time. So the first angel's message is located and locked in the time of the end. We also have the first angel's message beginning in this time period in our history. So let me reiterate that. The first angel's message is locked into a time period, the event, the time of the end, which is this warfare between these two warring factions. These two factions are roaring again. So the first angel's message will be locked into this event, and it's tied into the time of the end. So in this history, when the papacy comes to war against the USSR, we come to the time period which we're now in the time of the end, and the first angel's message comes into history. Those who have been on in this message from the beginning, instead of using this date, this time period from 1989 to 1991, they decided to use this number here on this date, 1989 as typifying this event. The reason why they did that was because in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And if you look at the secular news world, they horned in on that event, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which locked into this in 1989. I'm going to show you in the next part of the presentation, but what seemed to be an arbitrary decision is actually a providential decision, because it wasn't discovered until many years later that it was providentially selected in 1989. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say it's 1989, and I'm going to say now, without proving it, what I will prove or show it that 1989 is a date and not just an event. So we have an event and a date in the time of the end where the first angel message comes in. The same. This was the date and this date. The event, the time of the end, and the first angel's message. Now, the rule of interpretation that the Millerites used was a day for a year. We're all familiar with that. And can someone read for me? My brother needs me for a second. I'll be right back.
Now, the rule of interpretation that the Millerites used was a day for a year. We're all familiar with that, and we all understand that. The rule of prophetic interpretation that we used for the generation of 144,000, which we use and is not day for a year. The rule that we're using is that history repeats. Again, most people who are in opposition to this message do not accept this premise that history repeats in the way that we suggest that it does. Everybody accepts it as it was in the days of Noah, or as it was in the days of Lot. So should it be at the end of the world? They accept that the restructured Jerusalem typifies the destruction of the world at the end. But when it says as it was in the days of Noah, they don't go into the history of Noah and work out the events that happened and see the sequence of those events and try to get those sequences and lay them over into the sequence of events that are going to occur at the end of the world. They don't take you to that depth. So in that fashion, I'm saying they don't accept that history repeats. So that's the premise that I'm basing it upon. The other premises we're not familiar with is this one, is that the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25, shall be repeated to the very letter. It was fulfilled in the Millerite history, and it shall be repeated in our history. But without an understanding of this concept of these times of the end lining up in the fashion that I had done, when she says that it shall be repeated to the very letter in our history, we're left clueless to know when it repeats. When did the repeat begin and how does it repeat? What I'm going to show is by an understanding of this parallelism or this history repeating, that the parable of the 10 virgins does in fact repeat to the very letter. Tony, back yet? I don't have the screen
Yeah,
on.
I'm here, but I don't know where you're at.
Right here, but if.
Page
30.
Got it. But if you take these messages, the first, second, or third angel's message, and don't locate them in the space and time, what happens is you make a mockery of that statement. Ellen White also says that the first and second angel's message were delineation of events that occurred in the Millerite history. And she uses this phrase of 7 thunders when she talks about that. And she says, these things shall be repeated in the future. So what Ellen White says is that the first and second angel's message are going to be repeated. So the first and second angel's message are going to be repeated, and so is the parable of the 10 virgins. But the parable of the 10 virgins in the Millerite history was the story of the first and second angel's message. Was it not? First angel's message, second angel's message, the The history began here and ended here at the commencement of the third angel's message. So when we talk about the parable of the 10 virgins being repeated to the very letter, what we're saying is that the history of the first and second angel's messages are going to be repeated. And part of that repeat, I would suggest, means that we need to locate them in history, which is one of the things that people war against. So I already began to locate the first angel's message in history and locking it into an event. I already said that 1989 is a date, not just an event. And I'll go to show why I think so.
In other words, he's saying that it's about time.
Yeah.
It's a message of time. It's not just a message of an event. It's a message of time.
Amen. We then come to the second angel's message and we have a closed door. And then we're going to come to the third angel's message. And I'm suggesting that the third angel's message, which was the close of probation for the Millerites, translates to the close of probation for the people who are living in the history of the final generation. And I will suggest that this is the National Sunday Law. The National Sunday Law marks the close of probation for God's people. The empowerment of the first angel's message in 1840 translates to September the 11th, 2001. For those who are not familiar with this history, this date marks an event, and the event is this. It's the restraining of radical Islam by the West. And I would suggest to you after 9/11 that radical Islam was restrained by the West. The United States was the leading power. Sure, the whole world was involved, but this was driven by the West. The powers here that restrained radical Islam, these Western powers there, were 4 powers that did this. This number 4, which was literal in that circumstance, is symbolic of something that's worldwide. And so this restraining of Islam by the number 4 represents a worldwide restraining, because the United States didn't restrain radical Islam and went to war with them by itself. It took the whole world with him. Because there was the United Nations agreement that they could legitimately go and make war with radical Islam. That's why there are many states, many countries who were involved in this warfare. So the restraining in this history is marked by the restraining in our history. Now, as in 1840, that was the empowerment of the first angel's message, because this proves that through this, it was correct. So in our history, when we say, look, history is repeating, people say, or how do you know it's repeating? We'll say, so look what happened. They'll say it's not enough proof because it's not up on the testimony of 2. So what happens is, as we go through history, we see, but when radical Islam was restrained, which parallels our restraining of radical Islam in 1840, that we have now got a testimony of 2 in 1989 history repeated. And now in 2001, history repeats. So in our history, the empowerment of the first angel message occurred in 9/11/2001. The events are the same, and therefore the empowerment of the message must therefore be the same, because it serves the same purpose.
Kind of interesting too when you think about it, because you had a date locked into 1989, a time and an event, and it's empowered when you have the next time and event. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like a
That
date.
typifies, right?
The date. Well, what I'm trying to say is the date empowers it. Another date empowers it. So if we go along the lines of what I was kind of thinking, I don't know if it's right, but going along the lines of what I was thinking, that It's these dates that bring us to fear God and choose whether or not we love him or not. So you have one date, 1989, locks you into the first angel's message, and then you've got the empowerment that's also linked with a date and an event. So these sequential dates and events are continuing to lead us
Look at
and
the chart,
put that fear, huh?
the chart, that's what the
Chart.
Yeah,
dates
Yep.
and
dates and events on the chart.
Absolutely. Okay, so in May 1842, there was a chart that was developed, the 1843 chart, which you're familiar with. I'm just going to extend this out here because in 1850, we all know there was a second chart that was developed. And the second chart was the 1850 chart. The 1843 and 1850 chart, of all intents and purpose, are the same chart. We could say in another way, but this is the foundation, and the 1850 chart added the pillars. And the pillars that the 1850 chart added to 1843 chart were twofold. They were the sanctuary and the Sabbath. All the other foundations were already laid in this history. So the 1850 and the 1843 chart are essentially one chart. These two charts are the two charts that are spoken about in Habakkuk chapter 2. Now in our history, we've known about these charts for many, many years. There's no argument about that. In this history, the number, the contentious number that was, the contentious number was the number 1843, 1843. In March 2005, these two charts, the 43 chart and the 50 chart, were under investigation. And on both charts is a prophetic time period, the 2520. And this 2520 was first discussed, first issued like resurrected, and brought to a discussion table in March of 2005.
Sister Tony, I like how you what do you call it? Made the words like red, and then you emboldened the numbers.
Well, actually, you could tell that I'm learning on each one.
I know, I like that effect.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other one will be a little bit more legible, but thank you. Okay. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that March 2005, we had a parallel to May 1842. In May 1842, the contentious issue was a number, 1843. It happened to be a date as well. Okay, in March 2005, the contentious number is the 2520. By the way, the 2520 is on this chart, and it's on this chart, and it's on both charts, but it wasn't a contentious issue in those histories. This number was the one that was contentious. In our history, the contentious number is 2520. It's not 1843. And people, when they see this number, 2520, begin to make war against it. It's the cause of many controversies, just as this number was the cause of many controversies. And as the time marches on, we would expect that the second angel's message would come into history. And when it does, it would indicate that the doors are beginning to close upon those who are doing what? In this history, those who are proclaiming this number, and in our history, those who were proclaiming this number. So he's using two different numbers there. So he must be talking about the 2520 and then 1844. Anyone? Because he's talking about, so that's what I'm just thinking. Maybe it's 42. Anyway, The closing door in June 1842 started as a small event and begins to escalate in this time period. I'm suggesting that from March 2012, that the door begins to close upon those who understand and proclaim this message in a very specific way in relation to the 2520. This closing of the door occurred in Newport Church in Washington State, and the Newport Church in Washington State there was a higher level than just a local church level. There was the decision that was made that all those brethren who attended this church who were favorable to this message, that they should be disciplined, and eventually led to disfellowshipping a number of those brethren. So I'm suggesting that March 2012 is the parallel of June 1842, when the church began to close its doors upon those who proclaiming this message, which leads us to the last waymark. As the second angel's message enters this history, those who do this work, who begin to close the door upon the people who are presenting this message, believe that they are doing God's work. And this separation begins to occur, as did in the Millerite history. And it will get to a stage where in the future, and even through this scale is even though this scale is very big, it should be over here, almost on the top of the close of probation. There will be an empowering of the second angel's message, and there will be a proclamation made similar to the proclamation that was made by the Millerites. As we discussed in our previous presentation, if you reject the first angel's message, this history here, you cannot be benefited by the second angel's message. And what is it that you need to accept on the first angel's message? You need to accept 1989. But the war against the papacy and the USSR was a prophetic event that waymarks the beginning of the time of the end for the final generation, when the first angel's message comes into history, all based upon the repeat history of the Millerites. Then you need to accept that when towers came down on September 11, 2001, that the prophecy was being fulfilled and that Islam was beginning to do its work in relation to the third woe of Revelation 9. And at that event, Islam was restrained, fulfilling or paralleling the history of 1844 and all the consequences and significance that are attached to that event. And then that in March 2005, the 2520 began to be discussed and investigated. But all the truths that are censored around this number are in fact correct. And these are the events or the waymarks. But we are now being tested upon, as God's people, the acceptance or rejection of this message, this singular message. The three key events will determine our response here and where we will end up going, whether we will exhibit righteousness or will fall. I will add one more event here. This is when Miller formally begins his work for the formalization of this message. All this message gets formalized in a concise fashion in this manner. In 1996, huh?
In this time period.
Oh, time period? Okay. Yep.
If we go to page 24.
What did I say, manner? Okay. Okay.
Hold on 1 second. What'd you say, Christina?
She started at page 14.
Uh-huh.
If she goes to page 20, end of page 23, then she has 10 more pages for the next one.
She's going off of different page numbers than what you have. So what page?
Oh.
So I
I'm
have
on-
we're
I'm on
on page she's on page 34 in her notes. I shrunk your notes down because I didn't want to print out all those pages for everybody.
How many pages?
She's on
total?
page 21.
I have
57.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm on 35 right now, the top of it, in 1996.
The Rock of Ages.
The Rock of Ages. I don't know where that's at. Did she already pass that?
Mhm.
Oh,
No, I didn't. 1996.
so go to where you get to the Rock of Ages, I think is what she's asking, and then we break.
Oh, okay. Well, you guys remind me because I don't know where I'm at.
Yeah, I
Or what
would
does she know what
say
page
break
that
it.
is?
I was just thinking we'd break around 2, just before 2 probably.
Yeah, you guys just tell me when to quit and I'll quit. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Moving on. In 1996, this message is also formalized. It gets formalized in 1996. It gets codified in a coherent fashion that's understandable, that has some relevancy and meaning. And so it's an acceptance or a rejection of all these waymarks that decides whether you will exhibit righteousness or not. I want to add one more point here before I move on. So I want to add in here that I said that this was the cause and that this was the effect. This is a cause and effect relationship here. And this is the cause and this is the effect. The closing of the door is intricately related to this 2520. So that's a judgment. So who's ever listening to this presentation, whether you're sympathetic or antagonistic toward this message, if you'd be wondering what the 2520, what's it got to do with this message of Daniel 1, I hope you can see it clearly laid out here, that there's a cause and effect relationship between the two. A rejection of this message will drive you into this position. An acceptance of this will cause you to have the door to be closed upon you until you must be ostracized and put at arm's length. This number has this ability just as it did in this history here. I just want to add one more point. We mentioned about ministry of John the Baptist and of Christ. Remember that? And if you didn't accept John the Baptist, you couldn't be benefited by the administration of Christ. And the administration of Christ is this perfection of character. And one of these tests that God says his people will know that they are Christian by, what is the waymark that they know you are a Christian? And that is by the love you have for one another. So we're even learning that in this dispensation, which we should have known all along. More familiar to varying degrees on the 7 churches of Revelation. Now, the church that exhibits love is the Church of Philadelphia. What I want to do is the simple fashion is lay out the churches and map them over this time period. Your mind should already be taking away here because what I've said is first angel's message is John the Baptist and second angel's message is Christ. And how are you gonna be benefited by it? You're going to turn into a Christ, into this, in this history, and you're going to turn into a Christ that this mind be in you. And that's what the hallmark of that you love one another, which is the hallmark of the Philadelphia church. So you can already see what I'm saying. I'm going to get at this, and I'm just going to put it here. 1798, 1842, 1844. This is Thyatira, the 4th church. Next comes Sardis, the 5th church. Sardis means to come out of her, my people. They came out in 1798. This church here is the 5th church, or Sardis. And then in 1842, and the initiation of the second angel's message, two groups being diverged. One of those groups begins to exalt righteousness.
Exhibit.
Huh?
Exhibit. Right.
Exhibit. Okay, thank you. Exhibit righteousness. Begins to have the administration of Christ. They begin to receive the administration of Christ. The reception of it enters their life, and they begin to exhibit righteousness, and they begin to develop brotherly love. And this is the time period here of the sixth church, or Philadelphia. It's the church that has brotherly love from this time period here. And it's this time period where character develops, happens, and you develop a righteous character. So if you overlay this history onto our history, as I suggested, you get 1989 and you get 2012. You can see that if you haven't rejected this message for 1989 to 2012, what are you going to start exhibiting? You're not going to be a part of the Philadelphia church. So if you have accepted this information, then you have the privilege of entering a relationship with Christ. That takes you into a sphere or realm. Can I put that in the door? Let's see. Where am I? I apologize for that. Where am I? I'm looking for sphere or realm. I'll just start.
Accepted this information. Two paragraphs before the question from audience.
Okay, I'm just going to start here where it says so if you overlay, because I can't find it.
One down.
One down? Oh, there you go, because I have the big so. So if you have accepted this information, then you have the privilege of entering to a relationship with Christ that takes you into a sphere or realm where no Christians have ever entered into, the place where the 144,000 go. And you exhibit the characteristics of Philadelphia, which occurs under the administration of Christ, that brotherly love that we're all desperate to be a part of. So, as I said in the beginning of the laying out of this, is for those who understand this message and the relevancy of all this, is to see whether or not they find acceptance in these dates and these events, whether these line up as I've suggested. Because if they don't, then the conclusion is it doesn't have legitimacy. So we have a question from the audience. I'm not sure what it is, I don't think. I didn't want to get into the complexity of this because the churches overlay one another. So I'll try to explain it this way. The Seventh-day Church is the church of Laodicea. It's the final church. But this church is in its lifetime. So say this is the lifetime of Laodicea from here to here. It will experience it will go through the experiences of the seven churches. And so in this time period, it will go through Ephesus, Smyrna, then through Thyatira, through Philadelphia, and then finally Laodicea. What happens to Laodicea? Laodicea gets spewed out. And that final spewing out of Laodicea is when Christ comes and people are getting destroyed. This is the culmination of this. When there's this total separation and they had been spewed out. So this Philadelphia that we're entering, and the Church of Laodicea, the Seventh-day Adventist, is entering into, this stage of Philadelphia where one group is beginning to gather together and have this brotherly love, where this other group are going to further and further into Laodicea. You'll notice that from 1989 to 2012, there was Sardis. We begin there's a group that were coming out as soon as some of the disciples said, this is a hard saying, who could bear it?
What page are you on? I lost my
I'm
page.
on 37.
37. Okay, do I have it right? You guys-
Yep. Uh-huh.
Okay,
You will notice from 1989 to 2012, there was Sardis. We began, there's a group that were coming out. As some of the disciples said, this is a hard saying, who can bear it? I will say this, but this coming out of Sardis, what are coming out of? They are coming out of Adventism. And what I want to say carefully is this. This coming out of Adventism is by a hand that gets hold of a mountain and carves a stone out of this mountain. Not with the human hand, but with the divine hand. And this Sardis, this group that is carved out, not physical separation, there's a cohabiting, there's a mental separation that's going on. It's not who you know in the sense of human beings, it is who you know if you know Christ. But the Sardis here is the stone of Daniel chapter 2. And that may offer people who are listening to this, and I apologize for that, but that's how I understand it. And when this stone is carved out of the mountain Sardis, and it's the hand of a man, and who's that man? The man is David. And that stone in his hand, and he brings it to sling it into Goliath. The stone, when it does its work, is Philadelphia. Philadelphia does the work that brings down Goliath, Babylon. So as it's being carved out, it's very warning of Sardis, that church that comes out of what? What they are coming out of. They are coming out of Thyatira. And what this time period, and what is this time period of Thyatira? It's time period, it's darkness. It's the dark ages. From 1989, that's the same one. From 1989, prior to 1989, Adventist was in darkness. And from 1989, God's people began to come out of darkness. And that's what this coming out is. It's not a separation movement. It's a coming out of spiritual darkness where the scales come off your eyes and you begin to see what's happening. Because God has got these long tubes that come from heaven, and he's pouring his oil into your brain through the messages of the first angel's message, through these facts and figures, moral facts and figures. And this is what's carving out people who are now entering to the stage of Philadelphia, soon to be thrown at Babylon to bring it down. I want to talk a little bit about this 2520. There's many studies on the 2520, but I just want to bring up some points about the 2520. You'll remember at the beginning of the second presentation, remember what I said about this date here? I said in 1919, it's not an event, it's a date. So I'm going to show you why I believe that. Why 1989, not 1990 or 1991. Why it's this one.
Sister Tony,
oh, she's talking
Yes.
about stopping there.
Stopping?
Sister Christina said we should stop here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a good place actually because you're getting ready to get into it.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to be where it says, so I'm going to show you, right? Yep.
And I'm going to leave the screen, well, I'll stop share, but I'll leave that file open right where we're at. So
Okay.
when we come back.
And we come back at an hour?
I'll look at it. I think we come back at 3. I have it open too. Yeah, we come back at 3.
Okay. I come back at 4. All right, I'll see you guys then.
We're on the same timeline.
Yeah. Love you.
So can we have like, Sister Ally, would you like to close us in prayer?
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And pray for the food.
And pray for the food, please.
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for your kind mercy and your love, and for the gathering that we can get together using technology. We come from all areas of time zones, and we're learning these great truths that help us prepare us for what we need to understand as far as information goes, and to help prepare people to know where we're at in preparation for eternity. I thank you for Sister Tony's message, and I pray that each one of us can come back at the appropriate time to conclude our worship in our camp meeting this Sabbath. I also want to lift up the cooks in the various kitchens and ask you to bless the meal, who's going to be eating, when they're going to be eating, where they're going to be eating. Everybody's at different time zones somewhat. And I pray that the meal will be blessed and be nutritious and good for us. And we're thankful for the hands that have prepared it, for those who will eat. And thank you for your mercy and all that you do in our lives. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.